at Zion United Church of Christ in Thomasville, North Carolina, the church of which I am honored to be pastor. Our Sunday morning bulletin says that fellowship time will begin in the fellowship hall at 9:15 a.m. No one who regularly attends Zion believes that. If you arrive at 9:15, you might have to wait for those working in the kitchen to heat up another box of donuts. By that time, plenty of Zion folks are sitting at round tables throughout the fellowship hall, drinking coffee or orange juice, eating a donut or two, maybe some fruit as well. Conversations are underway at each table, some of them having to do with basketball or football, and some having to do with those in our congregation and beyond who have health issues. Now, someone may write down the name of a person with a need and hand it to me, and I'll tuck it into my pocket and hope I don't forget it's there. Or they may tell me a person's name, in which case I'll scribble it down on my napkin and tuck it away. And when I've finished my third donut and gotten upstairs to my office, then I can add this name or these names to our prayer list. By 9:30 or a little after, the teacher for this Sunday is at the front of the fellowship hall, standing before the lectern and ready to begin. We have a unified adult Sunday school class in the fellowship hall at Zion. It's not a large group, perhaps as many as 35 or 40. Through the double doors and down the hall, a class for our children and youth meets. On a good Sunday, that might be a dozen kids. Well, around 10:15, Sunday school ends, and hopefully everyone will make their way upstairs or ride the elevator. This is the first church I've ever served with an elevator. And then, once everyone is up on the floor above, we hope that they will meander their way toward the sanctuary for our worship service at 10:30. By the time everyone is gathered in, we're usually a Sunday morning congregation of around 90. Well, first, the announcements are announced, and then we sometimes practice a unique Zion tradition. At Zion, we believe that if the pastor and the organist/choir director have disagreements, well, we believe that they should work these out in public in the Sunday morning worship service. Now, many of these disagreements have nothing to do with music. In fact, one of them centers around the organist/choir director's suggestion that the large tumbler of coffee I take with me into the pulpit contains an adult beverage other than coffee. I would like to go on record as saying that this is usually not true. If it is, everyone at Zion knows it's because my organist/choir director has driven me to it. Really. Well, be that as it may. After the announcements, the worship service proper begins. I step into the pulpit and say, "Come, let us worship God." And we do. During the first hymn, our youth pastors lead their crew out of the sanctuary and downstairs for youth and children's worship. As the pastor, the one who preaches at most of these Sunday morning services, I would love to say that my sermon is the most popular part of the service, but I would be lying. By far, the most popular part of our service is what the bulletin calls the passing of the peace of Christ. Now, in some churches, that means that people greet one another with one saying, "The peace of Christ be with you," and the other saying back, "And with you also." Once that might have been common at Zion Church, but not so much anymore. This, the most popular part of the service, is better known as meet and greet. We all, including the pastor, wander about the sanctuary, greeting those we know and meeting those we don't. In the nearly 5 years I've been pastor at Zion, several visitors have said they have never been to a church where the meet and greet goes on as long as it does at Zion. I guess I'm responsible for that. I could step into the pulpit sooner and call everyone back to order for the sermon, which is what comes next. But we all love this meet and greet time so much that I just kind of let it roll on. Eventually, I do walk back up into the chancel and at least stand near the pulpit so that the congregation begins to think about heading back to their seats. At this point, chances are one or two of the choir members who have found their way to the very back of the sanctuary realize that I've decided it's time to preach. As far away as they are, they now sprint back to the chancel and take their places in the choir behind me. If, however, you are a choir member who does not notice that nearly all of us are now in place, and you are very, very, very late getting back to the front of the church, may God have mercy on your soul, because it is a terrible and fearful thing at Zion Church for the pastor to call you out by name for your tardiness. When I do, it probably does have something to do with what's in this coffee tumbler. Well, after all of this fun, the sermon follows, and the closing hymn follows the sermon. And usually by 11:15 or 11:20, the benediction has been said, and we're thinking and talking about where we'll eat lunch this Sunday. Now, this morning's lesson from the New Testament book of Acts describes the way the early Christian church did community. That's the title of this morning's sermon, Community. That picture of our worship service at Zion wasn't just a trip down memory lane for those of us who attend there. If you are not a Zion attender, now you know how we do community on Sunday morning at Zion United Church of Christ. Or to be honest, that's the way we did community until 8 weeks ago when COVID-19 changed everything. That Sunday morning worship and the other experiences of community at Zion, that's what we all miss so much. And I don't think we can know right now what it will be like for us in the future. When we are able to return to church, I don't think we will go back to doing everything just as we did, certainly not in the near future. We do want to take care of each other. We do want to be safe, and we do not want to be selfish. And I suspect that even the things we love most about our time together, such as meet and greet, well, there will be changes. In this morning's lesson, Luke, also to be honest, is presenting something of an idealized version of what community was like in those early days of the church. He's writing perhaps as much as 50 years after the events happened, maybe not quite that, but it could be as many as 50 years. Even if what he tells us here, more or less, is what the church was like at its very beginning, from what we read in the New Testament, everything didn't stay that way for long. Within only a few pages in the book of Acts, these first believers are acting very human. There is trouble in the church. The picture is no longer ideal. Perhaps it's verses 44 and 45 that people are most curious about in our lesson. Did the early church practice communism? Would that mean that we should in the church? The verses read like this: all who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. This earliest Christian church in Jerusalem, they are, by the way, still going to the temple for worship, so they are still part of Judaism. But this early Christian church likely totals no more than a few hundred people. It's small, relatively speaking at least. The kind of sharing that was practiced among them was only possible within a relatively small group. This is not communism where there is no such thing as private property. Obviously, there are at least some who own property because that is what they sell when there is a need in the community. They sell part of what they own to provide for someone's need. What they practice is an extraordinary form of community, but it certainly isn't communism. Now, more generally, in this lesson within the book of Acts, community we understand here as having to do with that early church being devoted to, often it's said, four things: teaching, fellowship, the breaking of bread, and prayer. Although Rudolf Pesch has suggested that really there are just two things that are mentioned here. The first is teaching. There is a devotion to studying the teaching of the apostles who are carrying on the teaching of Jesus. The second is koinonia, the Greek word that is often translated fellowship. The idea that Pesch is promoting is that fellowship, or koinonia, includes the breaking of bread and prayer. Breaking of bread here probably does mean what we think of as the celebration of Holy Communion. In those early days of the church, Holy Communion was celebrated much more often than most Protestant churches do today. Well, Ben Witherington sees this portrait of the early Christians that's painted for us as showing them doing all of this that we've talked about, meeting in homes. Now, they certainly don't have any church buildings yet, so they're meeting in homes. They are obviously treating one another as though they're family members. They're not only sharing Holy Communion, but they're sharing meals, family meals with one another. We have seen that they're sharing possessions with each other. Whatever wealth one might have, they are willing to sacrifice for the good of another when they need to. Now, don't imagine, by the way, that all of these Christians are crowded into one home. Even if there were only a few hundred of them, of course, that's too many to get into one home. So they are spread out across multiple homes when they gather. And as we said, these early followers of Jesus, they have not turned their back on the Jewish religion. Verse 46 tells us they spent much time together in the temple. They gathered daily there. Luke Timothy Johnson points out that they had been accustomed to spending time in the temple with Jesus. So they're continuing to spend time in the temple now for prayer and for teaching. The very first verse in this morning's lesson, verse 42, They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and the prayers. Although we're doing it online right now, we continue all these years later to gather for teaching and study. It has been our custom as well to gather in person to fellowship. We do that in part by praying together, by celebrating the meal that is Holy Communion. We celebrate other meals together at church. Right now, we are not able to do that as we have, but we certainly pray that we will do so again in the future, engaging in all of that wonderful time of fellowship and of study together. One of the things that's clear in this early church is the sense that there was a sharing that went on among them in remarkable ways. Their shared faith meant that they shared nearly everything with one another. They shared deeply in each other's lives. I read a beautiful and simple illustration of sharing just last week. Frederick was visiting some new friends in their home. Their young daughter was present, and when Frederick was introduced to her, he realized he had several pieces of gum in his pocket, and he took them all out and gave them to the little girl. As he left the house, Frederick saw the little girl again outside, surrounded by other children, and she was gladly sharing the pieces of gum she had been given with her friends. As a child, I'm afraid had someone given me several pieces of gum like that, I would have thought I had hit the personal jackpot. I would have put away my haul so that I could enjoy it over time, so that I could enjoy it. The little girl Frederick met, receiving a gift, immediately went and practiced community, practiced sharing. It's that sharing of community in all kinds of ways that we miss these days. God willing, when we can meet together again safely, we will enjoy sharing space together, sharing time together. And if this lesson from Acts teaches us anything, we will share what we can with those in our church family who need it. We will share with them to meet their needs. But whether in person or online, Zion United Church of Christ will continue to be a community. Thank God for that. Thank God that we at Zion United Church of Christ, in one way or another, we will continue to be a community. Amen.